Well, you know how it is when you set off on a long car journey with the children, and almost before the end of the road, they're saying, "Are we there yet?" This has certainly been a long journey to the Care Act 2014, a journey that began not under this government, not even under the last government, but actually under the one before that. But finally, we do stand on the brink of the first root and branch overhaul of statute in the social care sector since 1948. Next April, 17 weeks to go by my calculation, we'll see implementation of 75 of the 80 sections of the Act. Admittedly, the remaining 5, which will take effect 12 months later, are some of the most important, relating to the cap on care costs, individual care accounts, personal budget entitlement, and appeals. But this first stage is nonetheless hugely important, both symbolically and practically. At the end of a long journey, though, people often arrive tired, irritable, arguing among themselves, and this really is no exception. The noise of the dispute over the costs of implementing the Act do threaten to drown out appreciation of what it represents. So I think it's worth standing back at this point, taking stock of what the Act is setting out to do and what problems it's seeking to solve. The Act has, if you like, two sort of biological parents, the Law Commission and the Dilnot Commission. The Law Commission said in 2008 that social care legislation was a complex, confusing patchwork, and that we needed a single, clear, modern statute and code of practice that would pave the way for a coherent social care system. 3 years later, in 2011, the Dilnot Commission found that the care funding system was hard to understand, often unfair, and unsustainable, leaving people exposed to the risk of potentially catastrophic costs. So the Act, overhauling both legislation and funding, can be seen as a direct response on both those fronts. But it also has a third aim, which is the one highlighted in the Act's official impact assessment. Always worth reading those impact assessments for new legislation. The current legislative framework for social care, it says, is not just complex and confusing, it's outdated. Quote, it focuses on crisis intervention rather than prevention and early intervention, and it is focused on the provision of services rather than supporting the system to be centred around the health and well-being of people and carers. It therefore does not reflect the modern priority of care and support and is in need of reform. Thus the Act is at root an attempt to shift the social care system out of a sort of service mindset, stepping in when people become dependent, into one that thinks first and foremost about keeping people independent and deferring for as long as possible the need for intensive care and support. But I said earlier that the Act actually has a longer genesis. It was in 1996, still under Prime Minister John Major, that the government of the day published the first proposals for reform of care funding, a document called A New Partnership for Care in Old Age, proposing measures to encourage people to take out their own care insurance in return for some degree of protection of their assets. That same year, 1996, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a plan for free personal care based on compulsory insurance. So the two poles of the debate were planted then. And by the time the new Act is fully implemented in 2016, it will have taken fully 20 years to work that debate through and come up with what looks like, in many ways, a classically British, or in this case, classically English compromise. But a lot has changed in 20 years. The number of domiciliary care hours delivered by your sector has doubled, for one thing. For another, the number of households receiving care has more than halved, as services have focused increasingly on those in the greatest need. And of course, we've had 5 years of austerity, hollowing out our public services and taking what social services directors say is 26% out of available adult social care budgets, 12% in cash cuts and 14% in absorption of rising demand. In fact, when you reflect upon the plight of public services, and indeed the prospect of at least another 4 years of cuts, the Care Act looks like a bit like something of a hangover from a more benign era. That is still being implemented in this unprecedentedly hostile fiscal climate must show, I think, that the message has landed, you might say finally landed, that without a modernised social care system, the NHS stands no chance of coping with our rapidly ageing population. So what are the changes coming in next April? Well, the Act is very wide-ranging, extending from enforcing the post-Mid-Staff's post-Winterbourne view duty of candour on all care providers to requiring local authorities to be responsible for the social care needs of the growing number of elderly inmates in our prisons, about 10,000 men and women over age 50, since you ask. The principal focus, though, is on local authorities' new duty to promote people's well-being, a concept that's defined very broadly in the Act to include dignity, physical and mental health, participation in work, education and training and more, and a concept that will be tested very sharply where councils persist in commissioning, for example, 15-minute domiciliary care visits. Other new duties falling on local authorities include development of the local care market, promotion of integrated services, a topic we'll be discussing in just a few moments, and meeting the care and support needs of informal carers. According to that impact assessment, new services for carers are going to be the main cost of this first stage of the Act, taking effect next year, an extra £175 million, although the overall net benefit of the 2015 measures is put at an eventual £1.5 billion. The big ticket items in cost terms are the funding reforms taking effect in 2016. Argument over these costs is the dominant mood music at the moment. Both the total amount, estimated by the organisation London Councils at about £6 billion nationally over 4 years across England, only 2/3 of which at the moment is set to be funded, and also the different way the costs will work across different regions. For example, London Councils calculates it will take an average 4.2 years for people in residential care to reach that cap of £72,000 costs and then therefore qualify for free personal care. But it will take only 3.5 years in London against 5.7 years in the North East. While debate rages over this and over who stands to benefit most from the reforms, is the cap, as critics say, a boon mainly to middle-class homeowners? While all that's going on, there's a danger that the positives in the Care Act will be obscured. So let's just spell them out here at the start of the day. First, the cap on costs, significantly higher as it might be than the £35,000 to £50,000 that was recommended by the Dilnot Commission, nonetheless represents a hugely important break from the means-tested model that has shaped the social care sector under the post-war welfare state settlement. Second, the funding of the changes, coming as it is partly from freezing the inheritance tax threshold, is setting what could turn out to be a vital precedent. It links property and assets with direct benefit, and therefore opens the door in future to further trade-offs. Third, 35,000 people will benefit immediately from the extension of state support, and up to 100,000 will benefit longer term. And these will typically be people with relatively high needs but modest assets. And fourth, and perhaps the most important, is that the reforms bring, I think, social care into the mainstream. They provide a clear framework of expectations, making it easier to plan for later life, and most critically, they give everyone a potential stake in the system. All of us, irrespective of our personal assets, will now be eligible for state help beyond that cap. All of us will now be able to ask for a needs assessment. All of us will now have entitlements to information and advice, residential care placements negotiated by the council, and deferred payment of our eventual costs. So back to that journey. Are we there yet? Yes and no. We are arriving, finally, at a place where social care can start to feel it is shedding the poor law legacy that has dogged it since 1948. But we're not yet at our final destination. There are still big battles to be fought and won to ensure that social care is accorded the status and the resources that it deserves. Thank you very much.